Welcome to the Pain Science Education Podcast, where we discuss ways to treat and reverse persistent pain. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Tatta, a licensed physical therapist and founder of the Integrative Pain Science Institute, where we train practitioners on whole person pain care. This podcast also serves as a public health campaign to support those living with chronic pain. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Pain Science Podcast. Today, we're talking about the relationship between food, the immune system, and chronic joint pain. Specifically, we're talking about the condition called rheumatoid arthritis. My guest today is Dr. Sara Brown. She's both a doctor of physical therapy as well as a nutritionist, which, as you know, is a rare and powerful combination to help people living with chronic pain. She works at the intersection of movement, inflammation, and immune health. And she sees every day how diet can amplify or calm our pain system. We're also going to talk about the brand new food pyramid, or the upside down food pyramid, what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and what actually helps people change when they are in pain and want to change their nutritional habits. Dr. Sara Brown, welcome to this week's episode. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Joe, for having me. I can't wait for this discussion. I think it's timely and important. So thank you for having me.
It is very timely and important. Chronic pain and autoimmune conditions are on the rise. And we're really going to talk about the intersection of the two today, but again, focusing on rheumatoid arthritis. I'd like to first explore a little bit about you and your background and share that with all of our listeners and viewers. You got this really great combination of having a doctorate degree in physical therapy, and then you've also studied nutrition, really deeply. What kind of came first for you? What was the chicken or egg? Was it the love of movement and exercise and using that as a therapeutic intervention, or was discovering the power of nutrition to help people?
That's a good question. Yeah. So for me, physical therapy came first and nutrition came after, and then now we're blending. So this is the fun part. The movement piece came first. I've always loved wellness, and I played sports when I was younger. So I went the PT route when I was in school. I honestly didn't know what I wanted to do, but I heard that you could wear sweatpants when you were a PT. I was in PT for scoliosis, and I was like, sign me up. So I kind of took that and ran. Can't wear sweatpants as a PT, although I'll scrub sometimes. So luckily I did love PT anyway. I really love the anatomy of the body, learning how the body moves and all of the benefits of movement and exercise. And then the nutrition piece came after, more so when I started to practice PT. I, of course, had my own nutrition history that kind of, catapulted me into my love of food and nutrition. But then it was really starting out as a PT. I was in subacute rehab and seeing, this dichotomy of, patients that really ate better, patients who are in subacute rehab who are bringing their own granola in and eating that and not eating the food that we were necessarily giving them, which is not exactly a healing diet in those sorts of hospitals. Seeing those patients, and those patients did really well, actually. And then also I had one patient that kind of sticks out where she was a young stroke patient. She was about 50. And we worked tirelessly. She was wheelchair bound, couldn't walk. And we worked so hard. We were sweating every day trying to get her to walk. And every day I would roll her back to a room and there would be Taco Bell waiting for her, or she had just eaten it, and, a ton of Diet Cokes and things like that. And that just sticks out in my mind because that was a big aha moment to me of we need to do the other things in addition to the movement in our lifestyle to basically, again, are we moving towards health or are we moving towards disease? There's two options with our lifestyle choices. I do think it's a powerful combination to use nutrition and exercise. And I think we as PTs are the people to teach people about that, quite frankly. And as you know, and as you've worked to educate us PTs that, hey, we can actually do this. So thank you.
Tell us about your personal journey with nutrition and how that has influenced you. And was that part of your story that leads you into nutrition? Or was it once you discovered nutrition, started reading the evidence, that you started to, like many of us do, like I've done with myself, experiment on yourself and realize, wow, when I change my diet in this way, it impacts my health in a certain pathway?
Yeah, it was both my own experience and others close to me. So the long of the short of it, when I was in college this summer, of gross anatomy. In PT school, I actually, 2 weeks after we finished gross anatomy, I had jaw surgery and I had my jaw wired shut for 4 weeks. And so that was really interesting because that kind of really magnified how little, one, information is given about nutrition, and then two, how much I knew about fueling the body. Leading into that, I had definitely been under fueling for a period of time in college, ignorantly and unknowingly from not knowing enough about nutrition, which I feel passionately about changing now and educating people. But I basically, lost weight that I didn't have to lose. I was given really outdated advice about putting like raw egg yolk into smoothies and using like cherry pie filling and stuff like that just to like get calories in. But as you and I know, it's not just about calories in, calories out. It's really about quality of calories. So that was like, again, it was a big jump from there's this ignorance of not knowing how to fuel. And then I had a lot of downstream issues digestively, had trouble gaining weight back and things like that, and struggled with a lot of fatigue, was really, really exhausted for a period of time. And looking back, I know I had a lot of nutrient deficiencies, malabsorption, things like that, quite frankly, we normalized. And I kind of thought that I was just an adult that had a job. And I thought that all adults felt like this. And I was like, this stinks. I don't like having a real job being an adult. And so then again, as I started learning more, I started changing my own diet. I actually went from being a vegetarian to, when I went back to school, eating quality and seeing again the quality of my diet, eating more protein, eating more variety, even, there's a lot of benefits to just diversifying the diet as well. And so there was a whole layering approach that, like, it happened over a period of time, right? Like these lifestyle changes don't happen overnight, but once you start to feel a little bit better, that catapults you into wanting to do more. So it was definitely my own experience, and then an experience of a friend who had this wild like pain issue that no one could figure out. Um, who was also eating a vegetarian diet with a lot of those processed soy products that actually also a lot of meat substitutes are high in gluten, come to find out. And a lot of these things that we didn't know, um, contributing to issues that then were actually leading to this mysterious pain that no pain specialist could figure out until a doctor told him to reduce and take out dairy and gluten. And lo and behold, the pain went away. And then also this like weird arthritis that crept up went away. As went away, exercise tolerance improved. So it was again seeing my experience and others that I was like, wow, food is really powerful in, again, both positive and negative ways, depending on how you use it.
I like the things that you're saying because you have really brought um, a lens under when you start to change your diet. Here are the various symptoms that will start to subside. And you haven't talked about weight loss, and we're not going to necessarily talk about weight loss on this episode. I don't think it should be the focus of anyone's nutrition care. But the thing you said that's really important is starting to connect the dots between how you eat and how you feel. And once you start to see those little things, like sleep starts to get better, pain decreases, joint swelling goes down, your mood starts to change, your skin starts to change, your digestive function starts to change. Those are all things that many of our chronic pain patients, especially those that have rheumatoid arthritis, can relate to. And instead of just focusing on, let's say, just pain, there's a whole cluster of symptoms that, hey, let's just start with something small and let's see if those symptoms change. So I really appreciate you kind of leaning in with that to start on this episode today. So we're going to talk about rheumatoid arthritis. The word arthritis is, kind of thrown around in lots of different ways. And I think a good place to start is to maybe just describe the difference for our listeners and viewers. What is the difference between rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis?
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction that a lot of people don't know the difference. So arthritis, the word itself ending in itis, that suffix means inflammation. So we already know that inflammation is at play with all of these. And rheumatoid arthritis, we have some different buckets of arthritis, so to speak. So rheumatoid arthritis falls in the inflammatory arthritis bucket, along with psoriatic arthritis and ankylosing spondylosis, and those sorts of things, more autoimmune in nature. And that is the big distinction. RA is an autoimmune disease. which means that the immune system is essentially attacking itself. It's overproducing inflammation, and then it's too much of it for too long in the body, and then the body starts to attack itself in different ways depending on what autoimmune disease it is. With RA, it's the immune system attacking the synovial tissue in the joints. And then OA, osteoarthritis, is what most people think of when we say arthritis in general. People using the term wear and tear, sometimes more loading and mechanical in nature. RA, again, is more that immune mediated response and that systemic response, which both of them can have different benefits of diet. Of course, diet's going to impact both, but in slightly different ways.
So we have an immune system that's responsible for defense and repair.
Hmm.
And with rheumatoid arthritis specifically, our immune system is defending. Instead of defending against an outside pathogen, let's say like a virus, it recognizes our own tissue as foreign and sees that a defense mechanism needs to be launched against our own tissue, which is that synovial fluid lining that becomes inflamed in rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah, which is an issue, right? Like, we know that inflammation in and of itself is a good thing. It's just too much of anything is too much, right? So it's that unbalance of that system that then drives inflammation throughout the whole body.
So we know that it's very common with rheumatoid arthritis to see bilateral joint disease, so to speak. So these people have bilateral rheumatoid arthritis of their knee joint or bilateral rheumatoid arthritis of their hip joint. What are the biomarkers that we could look for that are different in rheumatoid arthritis versus osteoarthritis?
Yeah, so that's an important point too, right? Because if somebody's diagnosed with osteoarthritis, that would potentially be like a knee x-ray or something like that, but there wouldn't be a change in blood work necessarily that went into that diagnosis. Whereas with RA, there are some blood biomarkers that can give a nod towards helping with the diagnosis, in addition to the symptoms that you mentioned, right? The bilateral symptoms, which is more common in RA and often even in the smaller joints that aren't necessarily weight bearing. And so, on blood work, you might see just general our levels of CRP, our C-reactive protein, and ESR, the SED rate. Those are like general inflammatory markers, but they're kind of the best we have of showing like there's inflammation going on in the body. So those two might be elevated, but they're not specific to RA. Some autoantibodies would be elevated with RA, such as RF, which is rheumatoid factor, which is an autoantibody that could also be elevated in other autoimmune conditions, but rheumatoid being one. And then the more common one and more specific one being the anti-CCP. And that is a little bit more specific, another autoantibody. So this is okay, we have these symptoms. Let's get blood work done. Let's see if we have these increased markers. And then that's kind of where they go from there for the diagnosis.
So let's talk about a little bit about the cause or the pathophysiology that exists behind rheumatoid arthritis, the things that we know that lead up to it. Oftentimes in our healthcare system, people arrive at a physician kind of later,
Hmm.
and these things aren't necessarily talked about or screened for. But what are the genetic and epigenetic factors that we know contribute to rheumatoid arthritis?
Yeah. So if we go back to rheumatoid arthritis being an autoimmune disease, when in the functional medicine world, we know that any autoimmune disease, whether it's RA or not, there's kind of three, we call it the three-legged stool. So there's three aspects that we can look back to for the origins of this occurring, basically. So the three things being: one, a genetic predisposition. So there is some sort of genetic predisposition that I think a lot of people maybe put more stock in than anything else, but again, it's only one of three legs there. So maybe a parent had RA or another autoimmune disease, and that could set somebody up for a predisposition towards it. The other two being having some sort of infection or some sort of trigger. It could be an infection, it could be bacterial, virus, or the trigger could be prolonged stress, like psychological stress or a really stressful time in somebody's life. So, the stress bucket could be a lot of different things, but there's some sort of trigger that's kind of like, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And in addition to the genetic predisposition, there's some sort of trigger at some point in someone's life. And that could be any age in any year, right? Any decade. And then the third leg of the stool being a leaky gut, as we call it, which is really increased intestinal permeability of the gut lining. So, in simple terms, it's, we want our lining, we want a good fence to keep in what we want to keep in, keep out what we want to keep out, right? So, a good fence doesn't allow things through that shouldn't. But a leaky gut basically is like an opening of the fence, allowing things that shouldn't get through from the gut into basically the bloodstream and the immune system. And so, what can cause leaky gut? A whole lot of things. And you said the word epigenetic, which is a really great word. That is a newer science, basically about how the environment impacts our genes. So a lot of us think that, okay, my parent had this, so I'm therefore going to have it. But what we know is that really our environment plays the biggest role, and our lifestyle plays the biggest role in how our genes, basically whether they get turned on or get turned off. And so what we do, whether we move or whether we don't move, whether we eat whole foods or whether we eat the standard American diet, whether we're stressed or not, whether we have a high toxic load or a high toxic burden, those are all things that can basically turn on or turn off switches for these things basically coming into fruition. Really, that's just to emphasize that our lifestyle, our sleep, our movement, our exercise, our thoughts, right? Our relationship, all those things basically interact at the genetic level. So they're so important. And as PTs, it's a good place for us to kind of be helping people.
It's an excellent framework. So I just want to repeat that so people can maybe write this down or take a note. But there's three parts of this, the development of this condition. There's a genetic predisposition, there's some type of trigger, and then there's intestinal permeability. And I think if we go back to that first one, the genetic predisposition, it's important that we share with people that there's not just one gene for these conditions, that typically there are hundreds of genes that are kind of interacting together that lead to the expression of what we know as the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, which is the swelling, the joint pain, the obviously biomarkers that you're talking about. The thing we do have control over, the thing we can think about and start to consider for our patients are the triggers. There have been some research on different triggers for different conditions. What do we know about triggers for rheumatoid arthritis?
Yeah. So specifically with rheumatoid arthritis, there is talk about smoking being the number one risk factor for rheumatoid arthritis. Looking into the research, that's the strongest environmental factor. And so, again, we always go to making change. What's the lowest hanging fruit that we can do to not have this disease onset? Obviously, for this or any other disease, not smoking is going to be the number one most important thing. And the research does back that up as well. And then other things are diet being huge. So when I went back to school for nutrition, I did my thesis paper on basically the inflammatory potential of the diet, and how that impacts arthritis symptoms too. So even diagnosis and even symptoms of having it. And so the research is pretty robust on the fact that the more processed and standard American diet foods that we're eating, I call them the whites, tans, and browns, the boring colored fried foods that are basically high in calories, saturated fats, sugars, refined carbohydrates, but low in nutrients. Those are basically setting somebody up for a more likelihood for one, a diagnosis, and two, even pain in general or symptoms of pain with the diagnosis. And generally, like poor metabolic health and metabolic issues, which can arise in even other diagnoses as well, right? So when we start talking about blood sugar and cholesterol and waist circumference and all of those things with metabolic syndrome, poor metabolic health, which, of note, I think this is just like a wild fact, is that right now, as of this recording, 8% of Americans are metabolically healthy. So, I'm not great with math, but that means that 92% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. And so that when we talk about metabolic health, it's basically like I equate that with what are we doing with the diet? What are we doing with movement and those environmental lifestyle factors? So our typical, sedentary lifestyle and our typical diet are kind of setting us up for some of these things, such as rheumatoid arthritis. The smoking is huge, like I said, and then chronic stress. and sleep, those other lifestyle factors. Again, I feel strongly about talking about nutrition and exercise, but really the cool thing is that health is multidimensional. And so sleep, stress, relaxation, those sorts of things are all other facets that we can change and impact too. So high stress, poor sleep, poor diet, and then kind of leaning on some of those higher hits of like trying to get enjoyment that we often do via smoking or screens or alcohol or something like that. Those are setting us up for a higher likelihood for that trigger of.
I'm glad you mentioned metabolic activity. Just a couple of days ago, I was reading a systematic review that demonstrates that physical therapists can play a really strong role in managing someone's metabolic health. And these are
Nice.
physical therapists that are really entry level. They haven't received training in nutrition. There's a bit of it obviously in our training itself, and just with a little bit of extra, we can really kind of do that effectively. And I think it's important that we really say the metabolic health of the general American population is quite poor, and it is having an effect on all the conditions that we're seeing, not just chronic pain, but all the other conditions that we see in and out of physical therapy. Let's go
Mhm.
back to that intestinal permeability, which people know as a layman's term, leaky gut, which years ago when I first started talking about this and studying nutrition, I wrote my book, Heal Your Pain Now. People were like, I've never heard of intestinal permeability. She's holding my book up, which I really appreciate.
Right on my
Um,
bookshelf.
and years ago, people would email me and say, I've never heard about this, the link between intestinal permeability and pain. And my response always was Google the joint gut connection. There's a plethora. There's more now. I mean, that book I wrote was in 2016. We're now really 10 years later, right? And there's more and more building evidence. Help us make the connection between our gut health and our joint health when it comes to rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah, I mean, this is like paramount. And you're right, a lot of people still haven't heard of that term. I'm grateful that it's making its way into more and more. The definition is making its way more into talk about these conversations, but we can't deny it anymore because the research is there. And in my training, I was trained in the functional medicine side of things. And so that whole paradigm is really, gut health is the cornerstone of either health or disease. And all roads lead to the gut, and all disease starts in the gut. And so basically, if we want to figure out how to heal a disease, we have to go back to where is that coming from. And I think that that's something that we could do a lot better job in today's society and medical paradigm is not just like the diagnostic things and like the naming and blaming and pill for every ill kind of thing, but also really going back to like asking the why questions of like, why did this happen? Where did this come from? And we call it upstream medicine or root cause medicine of trying to get to the root of the issue. And so rheumatoid arthritis, the root of the issue is inflammation. And most all inflammation comes from the level of the gut. And that's basically because that's the intersection of our body and what's coming into our body through food, through what we're inhaling, whatever's on our food. It's the interface between the environment and then our immune system, basically. So we have our gut lining is one cell layer thick, and between our gut and what's coming in, right, through food, and then on the other side of that being our immune system. And that's important. We want our immune system on the other side of that, just in case, some sort of bacteria comes in that we need to recognize and attack. And again, not all inflammation is bad. We just need it to resolve itself when it's supposed to. So what happens with the leaky gut, again, if I can use the fence analogy again, right, of really large particles and a lot of things aren't supposed to get through because they will getting through that fence will mount an immune response because of all the inflammatory mediators on the other side. And so what happens is if we get these spaces, things leak through that aren't supposed to. Are they food particles? Is it a protein of gluten? It could be anything. It doesn't have to just be gluten. And actually, the more, if we talk about food sensitivities and things like that, the more food sensitivities we see, or the more someone's reacting to a whole bunch of foods, that's kind of without even needing to do testing. That can tell you, okay, there's probably some level of leaky gut going on because you a year ago you could eat XYZ foods, and now you can't eat like a whole laundry list of foods. So that's telling us what's going on with like the barrier basically. But what happens is that when that gut is leaky, basically things leak through, and one of the things being bacterial endotoxins, and those get into the bloodstream basically, and then that causes the systemic immune reaction, which then the immune complexes show up and in the synovial tissue, and that's what creates that inflammation. So again, we're getting the result, the downstream result is the tissues being inflamed, but that came from the whole body inflammation, coming from the whole immune system being like, oh my gosh, we need to attack this because we don't recognize this because this isn't supposed to be here, right? So the body's doing kind of just doing its job a little too well.
This reminds me of a patient I saw many years ago who had ankylosing spondylitis, which is immune mediated condition. And I started having the, very similar discussion to what you just had with regard to 70% of our immune system lives in our gut. And that is where that first layer of defense comes from as far as the human body's after our skin, right? Our skin is our first defense layer. The skin is this layer that covers all your organs. And the second, after you eat, because you're taking in certain things, your immune system is there. And his response to me was interesting. He said, I thought that my immune system was in my nose and my sinus passages. And
Interesting.
and that's true. It is there. Like you do have an immune system there. You even have a microbiome there, so to speak.
Yep.
But most of it is in your gut because 3 times a day you're taking in, or maybe for some people more, you're taking in food all day long, and that barrier needs to be there. And when that barrier is compromised, as you mentioned, there are immune factors that get released. Those immune factors travel to the joint and become lodged in synovial tissue, and that's where we start to see people having those symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, swelling, the joint pain, the stiffness in the morning that doesn't go away after 60 minutes. Like with osteoarthritis, you start to move and that stiffness goes away. With
Mhm.
rheumatoid arthritis, it's not as common that stiffness goes away. And that's obviously an early sign that is often missed.
Yep.
People do turn to the American College of Rheumatology for guidance and education. What does the American Academy of Rheumatology say with regard to nutrition as an intervention for rheumatoid arthritis?
So they do recognize in the conditional recommendations, which isn't like they're, hey, these are the hardcore recommendations. The conditional are kind of like the secondary recommendations, like,
Maybe you should try this.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like the B team, of like, okay, this could probably help. And they do call out the Mediterranean diet, which one I think is a great start, and it's not surprising because the Mediterranean diet is the most well-studied dietary pattern that we have, and it's important to look at the research and see what the research over time on any groups say. So, the Mediterranean diet being high in those omega-3 rich and anti-inflammatory fats, whole foods, a whole foods diet basically, which is high in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and legumes, like I said, fish, and lower in dairy and red meat. And then typically they used to say moderate amount of alcohol, and they specifically called out red wine before. So they do note that there is benefit from the Mediterranean diet. And when I did my thesis paper in looking at the research for rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis, I did find that there is more benefit and more stronger recommendations for using the Mediterranean diet for RA specifically compared to OA. So that's probably the number one best place to start because it's not like a very restrictive dietary pattern, right? We're not pulling out a ton. It's just getting a good balance of those good nutrients and things like that. So they do comment on that, and I am grateful to that. Although I don't think that's translated into the doctor's offices most often.
Yeah, that information still has really yet to hit the primary care space. I would say the primary care space that's taking care of rheumatoid arthritis. If someone decides they're going to change their pattern of eating and they're going to eat in a more Mediterranean pattern, which there's tons of different ways to do that, what type of improvements might they see? What does the research tell us?
So they're going to see benefits, one, probably benefits in blood work, but most importantly, in all that people really care about is how they're feeling, right? So obviously a huge one that we see when we're focusing on that whole foods diet, and especially those anti-inflammatory fats and things like that, we're going to see a reduction in joint pain, stiffness, and swelling and joint swelling. And that, if you talk to somebody with RA, like those are their main complaints and their main symptoms. So, from just a function standpoint and just a feeling better, able to do more standpoint, they're going to notice an improvement there because basically, what are we doing? We're reducing the inflammation systemically, and that will also show up in joint improvements as well. And then I always call the weight piece, right? And I'm glad that, like you called out earlier, we're not focusing on the weight at all. And when I talk to groups about people with arthritis, I always say like the research talks about weight loss benefiting arthritis, but it's not necessarily just the weight reduction. It's the benefits of potentially, if weight loss needs to happen, it's because it's lowering that inflammatory, systemic inflammatory component. And that's really the benefit. So I call weight loss like the beneficial side effect of that diet. And so when we talked about metabolic health, right, the reduction in the waist circumference, that can be beneficial as well too. But really the major things being just improvement in joint symptoms and a reduction in pain, which improves one function, and improvement in function improves quality of life. Because at the end of the day, we all just want to feel good and be able to do what we want to do.
Great. So we have some support through the American Academy of Rheumatology. But if we kind of stretch out of the United States of America and look around the globe, what are other countries? How are they other countries approaching the management of rheumatoid arthritis?
Yeah, so I mean that's of interest to me. I always like to look at what other countries are doing. I love the blue zones. I think a lot of countries do a really good job of being a little bit more judicious in what they're allowing and not allowing in the food supply and things like that. And I think they're a bit ahead of us in nutrition guidelines and using that specifically for disease conditions as well. So the French guidelines for the management of RA are similar and yet a little bit more specific. And they do call out the Mediterranean diet as being beneficial. And they do say that, specifically in the guidelines, they're like, yes, we still might need medications and things like that. And it's obvious that diet plays a role. And so we want to use, it can be yes and, right? Like, it's not like, is it diet or is it medication? It's like, okay, maybe you need medications and let's do diet as well. Again, it's people like to know what's in their control. And so why wouldn't you do things that are going to layer in more benefit than just doing one thing? So the French guidelines call out the fact that, using the Mediterranean diet is a diet in general is a great start. The Mediterranean diet, the best start. And then they do mention potential of an elimination diet of some level being beneficial. They also specifically call out, potential benefits of vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free diets. And those are a little bit lower tier just because there are studies on benefits of all of those actually in RA. And again, we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, but there are studies that say a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet can be beneficial. It's just more research talks about the Mediterranean diet. So, talking about elimination diets, I think that gets us into the discussion about maybe it needs to be a little bit more personalized because every person is a different person and has different needs, right?
It's always interesting to me when you bring the word elimination diet up, it's very triggering for some people because
Mhm.
they feel like where we're taking foods away from people. And I always remind people in the dietary guidelines, the US dietary guidelines, it recommends a vegan or a vegetarian diet, which eliminates a whole slew of food. So it's interesting that another country specifically says start as a Mediterranean base, but you may need to eliminate certain foods. And we know that because they can be more antigenic for people.
Yeah, and again, every person's different. Every person has those different environmental factors that are all kind of coming together in their body. Can we tolerate this or can we not? Like at that gut level. And so diet is really just like you said, we eat 3 times a day potentially. So that's a really nice place to start. I call it running an experiment, right? Talking about do we eliminate one thing or do we do a full elimination diet? But that in addition to being in someone's control, is not a very expensive thing for people. Like, yes, it does take effort, but that's what, we're here for, to help guide people through that. And I always say it's a short-term thing. If you take these out and you don't see a difference in minimum of 3 weeks, guess what? It goes right back in. And so I think, while yes, it can immediately feel triggering, to your point, yes, we're taking things out, but also it's like, hey, we can also eat all of these great things still. So it's like we're crowding in the good things and pulling out the, like you said, the antigenic or the pro-inflammatory things potentially.
And if there are things that have to stay out for a period of time, maybe 8 weeks, we can find substitutions for those foods that taste very similar or the same or have the same type of desire and reward that we're looking for. I love coconut ice cream. I'm not a big dairy fan. It doesn't, do well with me. And I love coconut ice cream, and it's, it can be something enjoyable. So turning people on to like the fun of food and the options that are out there for many people, not all people, but there are a lot of options out there for people to choose from. So we talked a little bit about different types of diets. And the question that always arises after that is, are there supplements that I can take? Are there supplements that are evidence-based for this particular condition? Because we're talking about rheumatoid arthritis. What does the evidence say about supplementation for rheumatoid arthritis?
Yeah, there are a couple specifically that are called out in high quality studies. Specifically, I would talk about three. There's more, right? There's even studies about saffron and ginger and things like that. Certain probiotics being beneficial for RA. But again, we want to use what multiple studies have shown, go to the higher level studies. And so, specifically omega-3 supplementation, which is not surprising because those are the fats that are found in the Mediterranean diet. Those are the anti-inflammatory fats. Curcumin supplementation, so that being that compound from turmeric. And then resveratrol being a strong antioxidant. That those three have been shown to be beneficial with supplementation in RA patients.
Omega-3 fatty acids,
Yep.
resveratrol, and curcumin. And can you give us a little more, like, what does the data say with regard to the dosage that is showing up as to be effective in studies?
Yeah, I mean, that's the most important thing, right? Is that if someone's taking a supplement, if you're taking a very low dose, it's not going to necessarily be of benefit. So we do want to make sure it's a high enough dose to show change. And so we'll start with the omega 3s. So the omega 3 supplementation, they found in a meta-analysis in 2022 in the Journal of Arthritis Research and Therapy, found at least 2 grams of the omega 3s were shown to have meaningful reduction in disease activity. So that would be of those biomarkers that reflect RA, to a dose of 2 grams per day to be beneficial. And that's for 3 to 6 months of supplementation, right? So with supplements, and this is the thing, is that you're not going to take an omega-3 and like feel immediately different. And so I think setting people's expectations of like, you got to take this for a long enough period of time to show change. Like, food and food components are extremely powerful, and food is medicine. And these components of food can be medicine, but they do generally take a little bit longer to produce an effect. And so I call them like gentle yet effective, right? So 3 to 6 months of at least 2 grams a day of omega 3s. And what was interesting too to know is that the EPAs and the DHA, which those are the omega 3s coming from the animal products, which, a lot of people hear fish oil, right? So those can come in fish oil, or those fatty fish, the smash fish, salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring, which is like one of my favorite things to talk about with people. But those animal omega 3s, those were shown to outperform basically the omega 3s that come from plant based sources like walnuts, chia seeds, and flax seeds, and that's coming from ALA. So it does help to know. Again, I love a combination of plant and animal sources for just about everything, but I do always talk to people about the omegas. We really want to be from the fish, because the bioavailability of the plant-based omegas, it doesn't convert into as beneficial effect in the body.
Excellent. And then if we start to look at the resveratrol or curcumin, there's some, so you mentioned 2 grams for the omega 3s, which are 2,000 milligrams.
Yes.
What about for the other two?
Yeah, so I'll go curcumin next, because that's again a very tried and true supplement. And so curcumin coming from turmeric, that yellow spice that people can often see in certain foods. So I tend to like a curcumin supplement just because again it's a higher potency. Curcumin, if we sprinkle turmeric powder on something, I think that's great, right? And it's a good seasoning, but also similar, it's not converted very well by the body. One, we need black pepper to activate it, to that piperine and black pepper to activate the curcumin to be functional in the body. And then we also need a fat. And so you kind of have to make sure those are all there for the effect. So if you lean towards a supplement, you know you're getting that dose that we want, and that dose being the studies showing at least 1,000 milligrams or 1 gram per day. And this was a shorter time period. So and this was a study in RA patients, by the way. They took a curcumin supplement, again, that's that higher potency, using 1 gram per day for 8 to 12 weeks. And they found decreases in the biomarkers for inflammation, the ESR, the SED rate, in adults with RA. And that was compared to a group that didn't have any sort of supplementation. So it truly changed their physiology, which is really cool. And that wasn't quite as long. That was 8 to 12 weeks. So curcumin is a really potent anti-inflammatory, and doses that honestly is not a huge dose either. I've seen, 2, 3 grams to be used with benefit as well. So I think curcumin is interesting because if we look at like it mechanistically works, if we look at the pathways in the body of inflammation, it's basically acting to inhibit at the level those pro-inflammatory mediators that basically NSAIDs go and inhibit too. So specifically the COX inhibition, and then COX and LOX is usually where the NSAIDs work. And curcumin, again, being anti-inflammatory, it lowers the NF kappa beta, which is one of the most pro-inflammatory cytokines that we have. So it's cool to see both like how it's happening in the body and that it does translate over into patients with RA.
That's an important message right there, that when you take a supplement, it acts on an existing chemical pathway, either upregulates or downregulates that pathway in your body. And the supplement does that in a way that is natural versus when you're taking a drug. And we're not anti pharmaceuticals here at all,
Right.
but that is a synthetic product that has a different impact on those chemical pathways than something that your body is used to over generations of eating certain foods and adapting.
And, a medication often has a laundry list of side effects, right? And so you have to outweigh the pros and the cons, whereas it's not that supplements can't have side effects, but they generally tend to come with less side effects, or again, maybe beneficial side effects too, right? So I think the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cascades are very interesting, because then in talking about like the omegas, right, those are working on upregulating the anti-inflammatory signals at the mechanistic level too. So it's fascinating once you start to look at things like that, and it really shows how powerful food can be. And these are just two examples. There's other things like ginger and boswellia and things like that are in the research that can have these same effects as well.
Yeah, and I love that at the end because when you combine things, right? You're combining changing the diet, you're combining different supplements. You mentioned three, but you also mentioned a couple other there at the end. When you combine those things, then you're working on multiple pathways, and there's more opportunity to optimize, obviously, someone's metabolic or immune health. In this case, what we're talking about.
Yeah, so like that's the really cool thing. And so nutrition research can be difficult because one, if you're researching something like curcumin, you're pulling it completely out of the diet, studying its impact at that level. But then we're not just eating curcumin all day long, right? We're putting that into a whole diet with all our macronutrients, other micronutrients, all these other things. And the cool thing being is, and this is what they show in the research, is that when you add these into like a whole balanced diet, anti-inflammatory diet, they'll call it the synergistic effect. So the synergistic effect of layering in those nutrients is greater than the sum of its parts, basically, right? So they can't even necessarily say how and why that happens, which makes nutrition research a little bit hard. But basically, once they study them and then you put them all together, the impact is so much greater. What the other one that was called out was resveratrol, and resveratrol is the polyphenol that's found in the skins of grapes and in berries. It's that deep, dark, beautiful red color that we see, right, in pomegranates and things like that. Antioxidants in resveratrol has been found to basically reduce the inflammatory cells in RA specifically. But that makes sense because antioxidants, they're antioxidation. So they're going to go in the body and lower inflammation. So antioxidants like resveratrol are a great one, but there's a ton of antioxidants in the body. So if we work on eating more plant whole foods, eating the rainbow, all the colors, there's a lot of antioxidants in there. And then we start to, again, layer those in, and those are all going to reduce inflammation together. And it looks beautiful on your plate and it tastes delicious. So yes, food, and yes, sometimes supplements as well.
There's a lot of good messages there, and people are receiving. I think podcasts like this raise awareness around these important messages. And messages can come from practitioners like us who have a license and who have studied lots of different parts of food, diet, nutrition, and lifestyle. And then there are also messages that people receive from the government. So just recently, a couple of days ago, as we were preparing for this on June 7th, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Health and Human Services of the Trump administration, under the guidance of Secretary Kennedy, just released a new food pyramid, which people are calling a flipped or upside down food pyramid, that has brought a lot of discussion and talk around this particular change. There, I would say, from the more traditional nutrition and dietitian professionals, there has been some kind of like pause and pushback against it. And then from the MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again movement, they are really cheering this as a big shift in public health, so to speak. What's your take on the new food pyramid? What are the pros and cons to it? Because as we know, there's no one diet that's perfect for everyone. But what do you think about the new food pyramid I guess we should just talk about public health in general, and then we should maybe put it in the context of rheumatoid arthritis, which is what this episode is about.
Yeah, and this is huge. I was just going to say the same thing, is that there's pros and cons to everything, right? And so I don't think that the new pyramid is revolutionary, and I don't think it's all good, and I don't think it's all bad. So, I guess we'll start with pros. I like to be an optimist. So what I like about it is that they are calling out the fact that ultra processed foods and high sugar diets and things like that are, things that are leading to this epidemic of chronic disease. And I think it's good to kind of make that connection for people, because a lot of people still haven't made that connection. So it's a call away from the processed foods, the packaged foods, the refined carbohydrates and things like that. And they're saying eat more whole foods, which in general, I think that is a good message. What they're, specifically, if we break it down a little bit more, they did increase the recommendation for protein. They about doubled the recommendation, which I do think is a positive shift. Protein is big right now, but protein is really helpful and beneficial for metabolic health, for repair, for providing necessary amino acids. So I think that that's a good change to be focusing on protein. They are a little bit general in where should the protein be coming from. They say high quality plant and animal based sources, which again, I agree with. I think it can come from animal and plants, but I would love to have seen a little bit more specifics on like what are those high quality plant and animal sources. Then they say, yeah, and let's pull in healthy fats, by the way. And that can come from full fat dairy, higher saturated fat things, and also anti-inflammatory fats. Like that's great for me to read because I know what an anti-inflammatory fat is. But somebody who doesn't know, I think it's a little too vague, the recommendations. And then, so moving over quick, they recommend fruits and vegetables. Again, we've always been recommending this, which is great. Specifically, if you click on it, it says to have 3 vegetables a day and 2 fruits. And that's to me a very severe, not enough vegetables to produce the intended benefit of what we want. Really, I counsel people to try to get up to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. And so I think that's, yes, we want to increase. If you're not having any, 2 or 3 is a great start, but we don't want to just survive. We want to thrive. So we want to go up from there, in my opinion. But then they do a big change is the reduction of the refined carbohydrates. The food pyramid used to have us have like 6 to 11 servings of whole grains or refined grains or carbohydrates. And we do know that that's potentially not beneficial for most people at this time. So I do think the call out to reduce overconsumption of that is beneficial. And like I said, I just think that an upside down pyramid doesn't really translate into like what people should actually put on their plates. I liked the picture of the plate and like this is how much fruits and vegetables should be here and what you should picture when you're making your plate. So I think the depiction of the upside down pyramid is less beneficial to translate into like day to day use. And then other benefits, I think they call out the reduction of sugar. So they're saying there's actually no beneficial amount of added sugar. And so I think that's a really good call out too. And then I did like in the longer version that they did call out gut health and saying let's have probiotic rich foods, and they gave specifics like kimchi, yogurt, sauerkraut, those sorts of things to be beneficial for gut health. And why I'm glad is that we talked about this. The gut is a cornerstone for health. So again, pros and cons to all of that.
The most interesting thing for me was that we haven't had a pyramid in a number of years. And you kind of touched on the point. The reason why we haven't had a pyramid is because it really didn't help people with the behavior change that they needed to make the change in their eating, which is why the plate was brought in. And if anyone who's attended my nutrition lectures at CSM or other places, I've never been a big fan of my plate because to me, it was just, sure, it had half your plate fruits and vegetables, which I think is a positive educational piece, but it doesn't really tell you what type of fruits and vegetables or what should you choose. So, and that criticism was out there for years and years and years about my plate. And I think the government before the current administration had an opportunity to change that. Because when you look at the Harvard plate, it does actually list out like eat broccoli and carrots and spinach. Like it gives people almost like a food list almost, right? So something you can bring to the supermarket and say, this is on my list and it's going in my cart and then it's going into my refrigerator and eventually will wind up on my plate. So it's interesting from a behavioral health perspective, which is really what we're talking about here, helping people with behavior change. Is the pyramid going to do that for us? And I think we have research that pyramids in general don't necessarily do that, that there's the counseling and the education, the behavior change that is much more needed to help people make a change in their eating pattern.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what you do an incredible job of and what you do in your book and why I recommend it to all the people that I talk to and my patients is because you're translating what's in the nutrition research into like, how does that show up in the day-to-day life? Like, what are you have actual lists of like, this is what you should get at the grocery store. Like you could literally take the book with you and go buy the things at the grocery store. You provide recipes, right? So, okay, that's cool, like more anti-inflammatory fats, but like, how do I eat that salmon and what does that look like? And so, I think reducing the barriers to entry is the key thing. And to call out your book, I think you do an incredible job with because you provide shopping lists, you provide lists of anti-inflammatory foods and healing foods. You make it really simple. I like to say this to people too, like, hey, what if you had a smoothie every morning for breakfast? I really like to talk about reducing decision fatigue. What if dinners were as simple as A, B, and C, and maybe you choose from a list of things? Because by the end of the day, you made so many decisions that to make another decision about eating a healthy meal when you have to like go search for the recipe or search for something is really hard to do. And I think that doesn't translate into change. And so I think, yes, it's providing people with really, really specific pragmatic information. And then two, helping them to translate it into like, well, this is how it's going to show up at breakfast, lunch, and dinner for you. Hey, have you thought about adding this to your smoothie? And then as PTs, again, I just think we're really lucky. I get at least 30 minutes individual with each patient in the outpatient setting. And I know that not everyone does. So I feel grateful for that. But that's 30 minutes that I can be saying, hey, let's do this exercise. And by the way, it's Macro Monday and I'm having mackerel for dinner with my lentil pasta. What are you having? And then, it's starting those conversations, but people actually really like to talk about that stuff. And it's fascinating talking about what people like and don't like. And we have to make it salient to them, and we have to tailor the recommendations towards their palate as well. So that's the fun part of the job, I think.
Many people love to talk about food, and you're 100% right. There's so much opportunity for physical therapists to help their patients with rheumatoid arthritis or other chronic pain conditions by combining movement, exercise with some really foundational nutrition education. Yes, as you start to work that way and with the just basic nutrition foundation, you will quickly move into things like elimination diets and vegan diets and vegetarian diets, even lower carbohydrate diets, which I believe has a place in our society, especially due to our poor metabolic health. Dr.
Yeah.
Sara Brown, it has been wonderful talking to you. You are a wealth of information for people that want to work at that intersection of physical therapy and nutrition. Let our listeners and viewers know how they can learn more about you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is so fun for me to talk about. I love it. Could talk to you all day long about it. So I am over at corerestorenutrition.com, and that's my website where I work with people one-on-one. I do a couple group programs a year, and I'm coming up with an anti-inflammatory diet plan right now that I'm really excited because I'm really trying to simplify this for people, and help patients that are really beginners that are starting, from scratch to try to reduce pain, just because this is such an easy and important thing. So thank you. Yes. So over at my website, and then I'm also on Instagram at Sabro, Sabro, for Sara Brown underscore restore. So Sabro underscore restore. And that's where I provide free information, some recipes on my Macro Mondays, and some things like that, where I'm trying to make it as fun as possible to change diet and things like that. And yeah, we'll see what's coming down the pike. Hopefully a lot more, again, pragmatic tips like you do for people, just to help the public. But again, if we're talking about RA, I would say first things first, yes, Mediterranean diet. And then two, in my experience, if you're going to start with an elimination diet, I would start with gluten and dairy. Those being the things that pulling out really tends to anecdotally help that population. Again, if you want to figure out where to start, that's a really good starting place for this population.
We'll include the link to Dr. Brown's website. It's corerestorenutrition.com. You can Google that yourself, or you can find the link at the website on the page, integratedpainscienceinstitute.com, where this podcast lives. I'm going to be doing more nutrition-focused interviews in the coming weeks and months. So today we focused on nutrition and RA. We're going to have more on nutrition and other types of chronic pain syndromes like back pain or osteoarthritis or neuropathy. So those are coming in the future. So please make sure that you subscribe. I'd also love if you join our community. So you can go over to the integrativepainscienceinstitute.com and sign up for our newsletter so I can send you the latest podcasts as well as information on integrative and psychologically informed care to help physical therapists and other healthcare professionals. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta. I want to thank again Dr. Sara Brown for being with us this week. Please stay tuned. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Pain Science Education Podcast. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. That's integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates and learn about our continuing education courses. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with your friends. Please join us next week as we share more science-backed solutions for treating and reversing chronic and persistent pain.